Well, the general goal in writing the book was to really approach the topic from a developmental perspective. So, when I started this journey in terms of writing the book, there wasn't a book out there that dealt with physical, cognitive, and social issues germane to the lives of African American children. Well, one of the things in writing the first book, I was astounded, overwhelmed, and surprised about the high infant mortality rate for African American infants, the high maternal mortality rate for African American mothers. What I mean by that is that over a 40 or 50 year period, the infant mortality rate for us as a nation has decreased significantly, but it has not decreased significantly for African American infants. When we think of infant mortality, we're thinking of an infant dying within the first 30 days of life. All right, so what causes that infant mortality kind of rate, or what contributes to infant mortality rate? Those are the unknown hidden factors, and why it persists even 6 years after writing the first edition, we still don't know. With reference to the second edition of the book, there are probably two significant policy changes that will have an impact on the lives of African American children. One is the Affordable Health Care Act, signed by President Obama most recently. What it does is it opens the door to better health care for African American children, better health care for African American mothers, and there may be the solution to decreasing the infant mortality rate and the high maternal mortality rate. The other is the Race to the Top, that initiative. That's the educational initiative. So what does it do? It pulls us away from No Child Left Behind, where teachers can actually focus on teaching, teaching processes, teaching how to learn, and that may better prepare African American children for middle schools, high school, and even college. So for the first edition, we looked primarily at infants through school-age children, so anywhere from birth through maybe about 10. For the second edition, and I'm really excited about this, is we're going to include some information on African American adolescents. And so we're expanding our focus, and we're looking more at it in terms of what I consider to be a more chronological focus with African American children. Well, one of the things that we're going to include in this treatment of the textbook is clearly peer relationships, juvenile justice issues, mental health issues with African American adolescents, family relationships, and how those might change with and for African American adolescents in comparison to African American children. And we're also going to include information on education and high school completion with African American. And the focus is to really identify those programs that work. Taft High School is a great example that we want to include in this textbook. They are doing phenomenal things in terms of providing mentoring, structure, family support to ensure that African American adolescents graduate from high school and go on to college. I hope other schools follow Taft, I really do, as a model. And one of the things is to identify that in a textbook, such as our textbook, where other schools can probably contact the coordinator of the Taft program to implement it in their own school district. For the first edition, we made it very clear that we wanted the audience to be developmental clinical researchers, educators, social workers. That was the agenda. For the second edition, we believe we'd like it to reach educators, researchers, undergraduate students, and graduate students, anyone who works to improve the lives of African American children. If I were to kind of focus anyone in on where do you go from here, let's look at health and let's look at education. So whatever material that we include in this second edition, focus on the health chapter. Kind of look to see or investigate whether or not this Affordable Health Care Act is making any impact on infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates for African American children and African American mothers. In terms of education, let's be consistent in our approach in providing quality education for African American children, for children in general, but certainly for African American children in particular. So is the race to the top, is it really going to provide the structure that we need to increase high school graduation rates for African American adolescents? The first edition, I actually included one of my former undergraduate students, Dr. James Graham, who's a Miami alum. And he actually worked in my laboratory when I first got here and helped collect data on an NSF grant that I had. And I was encouraged by a book agent to pick up I was told two things by a book agent. One was to lose my attachment to this book so it could get published in my lifetime, and the second was to pick up a co-author. So I immediately thought of Jimmy. He doesn't like me to call him Jimmy, but I immediately thought of Dr. Graham. And because Dr. Graham brings in a social development component, I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist by training, so he brings in that social developmental component. And so it's been a really good marriage, so as to speak. Started back in, I think, 2008, and what prompted me to do the research and to write the book and then to develop it as an applied line of research. I was invited to present at a conference, and this was right after the publication of the African American Child book. And they wanted me to talk about African American children with parents in the criminal justice system. And that's really something we neglected to put in the first edition. That will be in the second edition. We will place that information in the second edition of the African American Child book. But nevertheless, as I was researching and kind of building my background knowledge for that area, I fell in love with the area. I fell in love with the area for all children. So I approached my publisher and asked her if she would consider an edited version of Children of Incarcerated Parents. And one of the things that I wanted to do is fill a gap in the literature. And again, as a developmental psychologist, I wanted to talk more about theoretical issues. I wanted to talk about developmental and clinical issues for children of incarcerated parents. So what we did is we assembled a group of people who could write on theory, who could write on methodology, and who could write on developmental and clinical issues, as well as legislation and as well as programming for these children. So that started my journey 2008 in this area of children of incarcerated parents. Camp Determination grew out of my desire and the students in my lab. I'll tell you a little bit about how we got to Camp Determination, but it really grew out of our desire to really provide support for these children during a week in the summer. It originated from a lab meeting with my students. We were getting ready to collect data on spatial information in mothers and kids, and I just kind of pulled back and I said, let's do something that might be related to the book. And so all of the students in the lab at that time had experience as being camp counselors. And so the lab put together Camp Determination. It was a 1-week summer camp. A module-focused summer camp. What does that mean? It means that we decided that we would focus on some issue that the children might have to deal with. So we had a module on anger management, we had a module on communication, and each lab member kind of directed that module. And so what that means is they were responsible for creating the activities for the children. These were undergraduate students at the time. Yeah, Vanessa Harris, my graduate student now, actually graduated from Cal State Fullerton and came out to help us with the lab for the summer. So one graduate student and the rest were undergraduate students and Miami students, Miami psych majors as well. So day one of Camp Determination. Camp Determination was a week-long day camp. We started at 9 in the morning with breakfast for the kids. Then we moved straight into the module. So day one of the camp, we dealt with, I think, communication as the module. And so what I saw from day one of Camp Determination to day 5 of Camp Determination when they graduated is more engaging with one another, more engaging with their counselors. And a real reluctance to leave Camp Determination, a real reluctance. We did about a 6-month follow-up in this way. We sent out a newsletter to the parents, just kind of giving them some update, because we refer to this as after Camp Determination. So we sent out a newsletter. We also sent out a letter to the parents, just asking if they were interested in the child's counselor continuing interacting with the child. And then we kind of stopped the follow-up after that. Children of incarcerated parents typically deal with issues of anger, abandonment, hostility, depression, and then a host of academic problems as well. And so our goal for Camp Determination was to deal with anger management, and I think I said early on, communication issues, coping strategies, just so they would be better prepared at some level to understand or to cope with parental incarceration. Well, out of camp determination and out of my interest in this area, I was trying to think of ways I could carve out my own niche. So what's the big gap in children of incarceration literature? What's the big gap? And the big gap deals with reunification. It's like the elephant in the room. So why the resistance to deal with reunification? Because you've got people who believe that these parents probably should never be reunified with their children. But in all reality, they will be reunified with their children at some level. So that started my interest in looking at ways to better prepare parents to reunify with their children. And I want to be very clear, they're going to reunify in different ways. Some parents will go back into a direct parenting role. Some parents will parent on the periphery, and some parents will engage in co-parenting. So we started our first series of reunification research at Pathways in Cincinnati, and with a multi-method approach. Vanessa continued with her research for her thesis, looking at the kind of social support that mothers who are coming out of prison might need. We already know they're going to need housing and education and health care, but what do they need in terms of social support to help them transition back into one of their parenting roles? So that's the kind of the general thrust and goal of the reunification research. One of the things I've been doing most recently, and it's been with the Urban League, is I've been facilitating parenting groups with parents who are transitioning. These are both mothers and fathers who are transitioning from prison. They attend the Urban League. I think it's a 4-week or a 1-week group, a 1-week workshop that provides them with I think it's called soft skills training, job skills training, and job skills preparation. And then so at the end of that week, or that kind of workshop for them, I come in and I talk a little bit about parenting. And what's really phenomenal is there's an expressed desire to be the best parent that they can be, but there's also an understanding that their past will have an influence on how they presently parent. So we kind of work through coming up ways to work through that past to be the best parents that they can possibly be. Some of the advice we provide them is on discipline. How do you effectively discipline? A lot of the parents use what I refer to as old school 1950s discipline. That doesn't work today in the 21st century. So we think of, as a group, the more effective methods to discipline. And what I like is to play off with one another. How they really, I kind of step back in my role as a facilitator and let them give one another advice on providing certain kinds of discipline. Affection, nurturing. We talk about ways that you can give affection without surrendering parenting rules. How you can nurture without surrendering parenting rules in the home environment. The children do need a sense of security that parents are not going to go away again. But they also need to realize that if the parents do go away, because we live in a real world with real issues and real problems, and there may be a chance that the parent will go away again. But what they need to realize is that they're not at fault. You know, it's nothing for them to be ashamed of, that they did nothing to cause the parent to go away. This is the applied line of research, and my experience has been that when I talk to other developmentalists who are in this line of research, we all kind of stumbled into it reluctantly. And I think the reluctance was, I don't know what I'm getting into. But then after we stumble, we develop a passion for it. And I do. I mean, it's just an absolute passion. Last fall, I taught a capstone entitled Children of Incarcerated Parents. So I had 6 very dedicated, bright, ambitious students who read articles on children of incarcerated parents. They read book chapters. They facilitated discussions with their classmates on children of incarcerated parents. And as an end of the course project, they put together a manual for parents transitioning out of a corrections center back into their parenting role. And we did this in collaboration with the administrators from River City Correctional Center on Colerain. And they're actually using the manual. I was informed by the administrators that the parents are actually using the manual. So I will be going to River City on March 15th, interviewing the parents about the effectiveness of the manual.